Hi viewers, I am going to now present to you a module on methods of data collection in quantitative research. As expected of me, first I had to tell you the learning outcomes of this module. Students should be able to understand specific details regarding various tools that are used for collecting data in social science research, namely observation, interview, standardized tests, beginning with experiments in the laboratory and proceeding to inventories, questionnaires, checklists, etc. Besides various other methods that are used in social science research. Finally, the module will also elucidate some of the important aspects of various types of scales that we use for quantification in social science field. Well, as I said earlier, observation, interview, standardized measures, case study, sociometry, and so many more methods are used for collecting data in social science research. Just imagine a hunter going to a forest with a quiver of arrows. In fact, the first arrow which a social science researcher should use for getting the information is undoubtedly observation. Every one of us has got a pair of eyes which are visible. Not only pair of eyes, pair of ears, and every other sensory system is fine-tuned to get information continuously from the external world. So, in observation, what exactly do? We transfer the information obtained from various sense organs to one's intellect for knowing any object present in the external environment. It's a process by itself. In fact, observation can be broadly classified into two categories, namely self-observation and the observation by others. Self-observation, in a way, will be like introspection. Introspection means internal examination. Intra means within. Inspection means looking at. So, you look into yourself is what we call introspection, which is what we precisely do in self-observation. One example I can give you for introspection is SWOT analysis. SWOT is an abbreviation where S stands for strengths, W for weaknesses, O for opportunities, T for threats. So, when we introspect, we will get to know what our strengths are and what our weaknesses are, and similarly the opportunities and threats which are there in the external environment will also go observed. This is what we precisely do in self-observation. When it comes to observation by others, well, they can be classified into very many categories, of which just I am going to present to you only three. Structured versus unstructured. The observation can be either a structured observation, just opposite of it is unstructured observation. Similarly, observation can be participant, whereas non-participant observation. Third one is noticed versus unnoticed observation. For the third category, we use a gadget called one-way mirror, so that people who are being observed will not know the observer. That way, the observer goes unnoticed. Sometimes the observer will form an integral part of the very group which goes observed. There, the presence of the observer becomes noticeable. This is how we go about classifying observation by others as structured versus unstructured, participant versus non-participant, finally noticed versus unnoticed. Well, in social sciences, especially in psychology, the target for data collection is responses, a variety of responses. And these responses are broadly classified into two categories, namely intrapersonal versus interpersonal responses. Intrapersonal responses in turn are classified into two categories, namely overt versus covert responses. Overt means observable, which manifests itself externally in terms of various motor responses, whereas covert responses are visceral, they are internal, which can be either affective in nature or cognitive in nature. This is how we classify intrapersonal responses, whereas interpersonal responses are of three types. They can be either asocial or antisocial or prosocial. Antisocial is definitely destructive in nature. Prosocial is definitely constructive in nature. Asocial, where the direction of any given individual may not be that explicitly seen. Maybe the withdrawal itself can be taken as an example of asocial response. I have listed as many as 9 motor responses. In fact, the list is endless. Anything which is pertaining to any set of muscles will definitely produce a response. For example, sitting is a motor response. Standing is another motor response. Stretching is yet another motor response. Speaking again is a motor response. Showing, shouting, singing, smiling, signaling. As I said earlier, the list is endless. They are all motor responses because each of these responses does involve a muscle or a set of muscles. So, muscles stand as the viable medium of any given individual's mind. Mind speaks through muscles. Well, these are the parameters on which quantification is done. Having listed responses in terms of intrapersonal versus interpersonal, we now will have to move on to the quantification procedure. What are the parameters on which quantification of these responses is done? First one, frequency. Second one is intensity. Third one is duration. These three are applicable in any field, whereas fourth and the last parameter is by and large applicable in clinical field, that is chronicity. By frequency we mean number of times any particular response occurs over a period of time. So, number of times of occurrence is what we call frequency, whereas intensity of response indicates strength of that response. For example, whether I speak or shout. When I shout, whether it is legible, understandable by others, in fact, all these things will indicate how strong that response called speaking is. Duration, for how long that response has occurred, is what we call duration. As I said earlier, in clinical field, we also look into the chronicity aspect. Since when the response has been occurring. For example, fainting. Fainting is one motor response, and when we collect data in the clinical field, definitely we need to find out from the informant from when that particular person has been having that problem called fainting, which is a signal of a pathology, underlying pathology. So, chronicity gets added to the list of parameters in the clinical field when we go for observation or, for that matter, any other method which I will be introducing to you one by one in this module. Well, when it comes to the methodology that we follow for observation, either with any gadget or even without a gadget, one can do time sampling, and frequency and duration of the response can be observed. on the way to quantification? Well, we have now a lot of sophisticated instruments which aid the researcher in the observation process. Therefore, it's an added advantage for the researcher when he or she goes for observation as the main technique for collecting data. As I said earlier, interpersonal responses are of three types, of which the first two are asocial response, where either no communication takes place or very little communication takes place between any two individuals. When I say communication, I mean both verbal and non-verbal. Non-verbal is body language. Antisocial responses is definitely a destructive behavior like attacking, stealing, sexual harassment, spreading rumors. Well, the list is endless. When it comes to prosocial responses, which is what we would like to promote, before promoting we will have to find out in how many people these responses occurred fluently, in how many people we need to introduce them on the way to investigate various aspects pertaining to prosocial responses. One example of a prosocial response is a genuine smile, smiling, and so many more adaptive responses ought to follow the first response of smiling, which I consider a prosocial response. Well, these are the general steps that we follow in observation method. First, we select and subsequently we define the behavioral aspects for quantification. Step 2 is to evolve procedures for recording. The step 3 or the third step is to train observers for uniformity so that we can avoid ups and downs in the data sheet, by which I mean errors can be minimized. From observation, we now move on to the second method called interview. Interview is a face-to-face interaction between two or more individuals, of whom one is called the interviewer, who asks questions to elicit information, while the rest is called interviewee. Or suppose you have more than one individual for interview, they are called interviewees. They give responses to the questions asked in the process. You see, human personality is a very nebulous one, it's a complex one, and so many more complexities we come across in the social science research. Therefore, observation alone will not suffice. You need to go into the details, which we collect first through observation, and interview is the next step, so that you can get a lot more information about any given individual by pressing interview into the process of data collection. There are three types of interview, namely structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. Structured interview is also called standardized interview or a researcher administered survey. It's a quantitative research method commonly employed in survey research. The same questions are presented in the same order to all the respondents. There are two important aspects to be noted here, namely, first one, items or questions will form the main part. Equally important is the second aspect, namely response format for quantification. Both have to remain just the same for all individuals in the sample as far as structured interview is concerned. General steps for conducting structured interview are three in number. Step 1 is to develop interview questions along with the response format. Step 2 is to present the items and score the responses. Third and the final step is to grade the score as per norms by taking further notes if possible as a supplementary method. Let me evaluate the merits and demerits of structured interview method. The first advantage is clarity in items. There won't be any ambiguity at all. Therefore, it is very easy for us to score the responses. Once scoring is made simple, automatically interpretation becomes pretty easy. These are the three advantages which go with structured interview. But on the side of disadvantages, we have two definite disadvantages, namely response set, by which we mean methodical way of answering without processing the contents of the items. Mechanically, they will go about responding to the questions. This is one inevitable disadvantage that goes with structured interview method. Second disadvantage is that they can very well fake good by coming out with socially desirable responses. In semi-structured interview method, we are very flexible by asking a few predetermined questions, while the rest will arise in a free-flowing conversation based on the situation. Again, there are three steps. First step is to write down most important questions. Step 2 is to develop a few conversation starters and present the questions. Third and the final step is to follow the natural flow of responses. Ask follow-up questions for further exploration. Again, we have merits and demerits going with the semi-structured interview method. On the side of merits, well, it is less rigid than structured interview, and there is no room for response set, and there is a very remote possibility for social desirability. On the other hand, demerits are also there. The first demerit is that it is less objective in response coding, and also it is a bit hard to quantify the responses. Now we move on to the third and final type of interview called unstructured interview, which is informal or casual in nature. Though questions are not prepared in advance, random questions are not at all asked. We begin with the usual phrase, "Tell me about yourself." Then we present the questions by keeping in view the purpose of interview. And then with that focus, we proceed flexibly as per the respondent's answers. When we evaluate the unstructured interview method, on the side of merits, well, we have two definite merits. The first merit is total flexibility. Though there is a definite focus, well, flexibility is an integral part of unstructured interview. Second one, very important one, we establish rapport. Rapport, well, is not at all phonetic. The last two letters are silent. Though it is spelled out as rapport, the pronunciation is rapport. The main aim of establishing rapport is to break resistance so that we will get to know the internal world with ease. On the side of demerits, we have high distractibility, high subjectivity in scoring, and excessive emotional involvement in personal aspects. Further assessment methods are also there. In fact, here I have constructed a 2x2 contingency cell, keeping structure and disguise as the two main aspects. Coming out of this 2x2 cell is structured versus structured and disguised, unstructured versus disguised, structured and undisguised, unstructured and disguised. Structured, disguised, experimentation in laboratory and field, then battery of performance tests are there in the first quadrangle, which are structured and disguised, whereas in unstructured and disguised, we have a variety of projective tests, and in the third category called structured and undisguised, we have inventories / questionnaires, checklists, rating scales. The fourth and the last, unstructured and undisguised, open-ended interview, introspection, especially related to that particular state. Types of scales, we have 4. The most rudimentary one is nominal, where numbers are used just to categorize the type of responses. Otherwise, they don't carry any numerical value at all. A shade better than nominal method is ordinal, where we go by the rank order principle. The third one is the most sophisticated one, along with the fourth, interval and ratio scale. Interval scale is a measurement in actual with an arbitrary zero, whereas in ratio scale it is specific numerical value with true 0 point. Therefore, negative values are not possible in ratio scale. An important note, depending upon the objective of investigation, responses are collected and quantified on the basis of any of the 4 types of scales mentioned in the previous slide. Parametric statistics can be used for analysis only when scores are obtained on interval and ratio scale. Those scores got through the other 2 scales, namely nominal and ordinal, can also be statistically analyzed. Their non-parametric statistics are recommended for analysis. Mind you, non-parametric statistics are less powerful than the parametric ones. Ethical aspects is what I'd like to touch upon as a final note in this module. Maintenance of confidentiality. Maintenance of confidentiality is mandatory, because with great difficulty we get to know various aspects of any segment of the population. So we are not supposed to lose their confidence. Therefore, we need to maintain confidentiality, and we will have to keep the names anonymous. So we will have to strictly follow this principle. Second one, resistance has to be broken to know about the inner world, but with the broken resistance, they cannot go back to society. Therefore, we will have to rebuild resistance. It's a protective factor. Then we will have to avoid exploiting the pathology for which we have conducted the study of any given population. Therefore, we need to avoid the exploitation also. Finally, we will have to get the consent of respondents before we go for data collection. These are the books I wish to recommend for further reading. Thank you and best wishes for a bright future.